Every hero in the Bible's book of Judges is a mess, not a little messy, a full-blown disaster. One of them is a coward hiding in a winepress, terrified of the enemy outside. Another sneaks a homemade sword into a private meeting and uses it on a king. One makes a promise so reckless it costs him his own daughter. And the most famous strongman in the book falls for the exact same trap, 3 separate times, even after it nearly kills him twice before. Here's the twist. God picked every single one of them on purpose. You've probably heard Bible heroes described as brave, faithful, larger than life, the kind of people you'd want leading your team. That's not what the book of Judges shows you. It shows flawed, scared, sometimes selfish people getting handed a job they never applied for and definitely didn't feel ready to do. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly why God worked this way, over and over, for centuries. And you'll see a pattern that shows up again and again through Scripture. A pattern that actually says something about you too, whether you feel ready for anything right now or not. So why does the Bible's list of heroes read more like a rap sheet than a highlight reel? Why does God keep skipping past the strong, confident, obvious choices and picking the outcasts instead, again and again, book after book? Stick around, because this gets a lot clearer than you think once you see the pattern laid out. We're covering the book of Judges today, start to finish, judge by judge. It sits right after the book of Joshua in your Bible, which matters more than you'd expect. Joshua ends with Israel finally settled in the promised land after decades of wandering and waiting. Judges picks up the story right after that, during a chaotic, unstable stretch before Israel ever had a king to unify them. Historically, this period runs from roughly 1200 to 1050 BC, a rough 200 years of cycles. Tradition credits the prophet Samuel as the writer, though the text itself never actually names him directly. It was written for the people of Israel, most likely compiled during the era of the kings, as both a warning and a reminder of exactly where the nation came from. Now let's get into the actual pattern the whole book runs on, because once you see it clearly, you genuinely cannot unsee it again. Judges 2 lays the cycle out in 4 repeating steps. Israel sins and turns away. God allows an enemy nation to oppress them as a result. Israel eventually cries out for help and rescue. God sends a judge to deliver them from that oppression. Judges 2:16 puts it plainly. Then the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hand of those that spoiled them. Then peace holds for a while, sometimes decades. Then Israel slowly drifts back into the exact same sin. And the whole cycle starts over again from step 1. Judges 2:1-9 says that as soon as each judge died, the people corrupted themselves more than their fathers. That's not one bad chapter tucked into the book. That's the entire structure holding the whole thing together. Sin, oppression, rescue, peace, repeat. This cycle plays out roughly 12 separate times across the book. Let's meet a few of these judges and see exactly how unlikely each pick really was. First up, Othniel, who barely gets a mention but sets the template for everyone after him. Israel sins, gets oppressed by a foreign king, cries out for rescue, and Othniel simply shows up to save the day. Simple pattern, first example, nothing flashy. Next, Ehud. Israel is stuck under Moabite control at this point, forced to pay heavy tribute to a king named Eglon. Ehud happens to be left-handed, which back then was actually seen as a real disadvantage, almost a defect. He straps a short sword to his right thigh instead of his left, exactly where the guards weren't checking. He secures a private meeting with the king, and Judges 3:21 says he took the dagger from his right thigh and thrust it into his belly. Brutal, sudden, and completely unexpected from a man nobody took seriously. Then there's Deborah, a woman, a prophet, and a judge, all at once during a time when leadership almost always went straight to men. Judges 4:4 calls her out by name, and Deborah a prophetess. She judged Israel at that time. She never picks up a sword herself. Instead, she organizes the entire battle plan and hands the credit to a general named Barak, a man who refuses to even go to war unless she comes with him. See the pattern building already? A quiet nobody. A left-handed outsider. A woman leading in a world built to overlook women completely. None of them fit the mold of a typical, expected hero, and that's before we even reach the two biggest names in the whole book. Let's keep going, because it genuinely gets more extreme from here. Gideon is hiding inside a wine press, threshing wheat in total secret so raiders won't spot and steal it, when an angel walks up and calls him a mighty man of valor. Gideon's reaction is basically, "Are you sure you're talking to me?" Judges 6:15 has him say it outright, no filter at all. "Where shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poor in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." He even asks God for proof twice, laying out a wet fleece on dry ground and then a dry fleece on wet ground, just to be absolutely sure. God doesn't argue with any of it. God just tells him to go anyway, doubts and all. Then God shrinks his army from 32,000 men down to a mere 300, entirely on purpose, so nobody could later claim the victory came down to manpower or numbers. Small army, massive point being made. Then there's Jephthah. Judges 11 says he's the son of a prostitute, kicked out and disowned by his own half-brothers, forced to survive as an outcast leading a ragtag gang of other rejected men. When Israel suddenly needs a skilled military leader, the very people who once threw him out come crawling back to beg for his help. He says yes anyway. He wins the battle. But he also makes a reckless, careless vow beforehand that ends up costing him his own daughter, a sobering reminder that even the judges God used still made devastating, painful choices along the way. And finally, Samson, set apart before birth as a Nazirite, never allowed to cut his hair or touch anything unclean. Strongest man in the entire book, weakest self-control by far. He falls for the same manipulation from Delilah 3 separate times before finally losing everything, his strength, his eyesight, and his freedom all in one collapse. Even then, blind and chained in his final moment, God still uses him for one last act of deliverance against Israel's enemies. Nobody on this list looks like a hero on paper, not even close. A left-handed assassin. Nobody respected. A woman leading men who wouldn't lead themselves. A terrified farmer hiding from raiders. An outcast running a gang of rejects. A strongman who kept saying yes to the wrong person. That's the entire cast driving this book forward. So what does this actually mean for you, sitting here watching this right now? It means the qualification was never really the qualification people assume it was. Being confident, popular, strong, or naturally impressive was never the actual requirement for being used. Being available and willing to show up, flaws included, was the requirement the whole time. Think about it like this for a second. If you've ever felt too unqualified, too flawed, or too messy of a past to be useful for something that actually matters, the book of Judges was basically written with you in mind. Paul says something almost identical centuries later in 2 Corinthians 12:9. My strength is made perfect by weakness. That's not some random coincidence tucked into a letter. That's the exact same pattern showing up all over again, generations apart. Practically speaking, that means you don't need to have your entire life fully figured out before taking the next step you already know you're being called toward. Gideon certainly didn't wait until he felt ready. Deborah stepped into a role nobody around her expected a woman to fill, and led anyway. Even Samson, despite every one of his repeated failures, still had a clear purpose woven into the larger story. Now let's clear up a couple things people usually get wrong about this whole book. First, people assume judge meant courtroom judge, robe and gavel included. Not quite the case here. These were military and spiritual leaders raised up specifically during moments of national crisis. Think far less courtroom and a lot more emergency response team parachuting in when things fall apart. Second, people assume Deborah was some rare, isolated exception, basically the only woman who ever mattered across the entire Old Testament. She's certainly rare within this specific book, sure, but she's never treated as some odd fluke. Judges chapters 4 and 5 actually give her more coverage and more respect than most of the male judges receive, combined. Third, people wonder why the Bible even bothers with Samson and Jephthah's obvious failures, instead of quietly cleaning up their stories for a better legacy. That's actually the entire point being made. Hebrews 11:32 lists Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah by name, right alongside the prophets, as genuine examples of faith worth remembering, not because any of them were perfect people, because they still showed up when it actually mattered, flaws, failures, and all. Fourth, people assume the book ends on some kind of triumphant, satisfying note. It really doesn't. Judges spirals downward into some genuinely dark stories toward the end, closing with a haunting line in Judges 21:25 about how everyone simply did what was right in his own eyes. That's less an ending and more a setup, quietly pointing toward Israel's eventual need for a king. So here's exactly where we land after all of this. The book of Judges was never meant to be a highlight reel packed with flawless heroes. It's a pattern of ordinary, flawed, deeply unlikely people who got picked anyway, and then chose to act when it actually counted most. That question from the very start finally makes complete sense now. God doesn't keep choosing unlikely people by some accident or oversight. He keeps choosing them entirely on purpose, because the story was never really about how impressive the person looked on paper. It was always about what happens the moment an unlikely person finally says yes. Here's a thought worth sitting with before you go anywhere else today. If God can use a coward, an outcast, and a repeat offender to change an entire nation's story, the excuse that you're simply not ready probably isn't holding up quite as well as it used to. Go read the book of Judges for yourself sometime this week. It's short, it moves fast, and it honestly reads more like a thriller than most people expect from the Old Testament. Then drop a comment down below and tell me which judge surprised you the most out of everyone we covered and why that one stuck with you. Subscribe if you want next week's lesson to land straight in your feed, because we're working through the Bible together one book at a time.